In this video, we'll be looking at the geometry TEKs for first grade. 1.6a, 1.6b, 1.6c, 1.6d, 1.6e, and 1.6f. For geometry in first grade, the students are to be looking at two-dimensional shapes and three-dimensional shapes. The majority of the TEKs, though, will focus on two-dimensional shapes. So the first thing, or one of the things the students are going to be looking at, is to classify and sort regular and irregular shapes. So this sheet just shows you some regular and irregular shapes. This first column and this third column show you examples of regular shapes. All of the sides are the same length. All of the angles are the same in each of these shapes. Whereas the second column and the fourth column are irregular shapes. The sides are different lengths and the angles are all different. So students have to be able to classify and sort shapes based on regular or irregular. Students will also be looking at attributes that define a two-dimensional shape and three-dimensional shapes. So first of all, we'll look at the two-dimensional shapes. The attributes that define a two-dimensional shape would be the number of sides on the shape and the number of vertices on that shape, or the lack of when we talk about a circle. The color, the size of the shape, even the thickness. These are attribute blocks, and you can see that the thicknesses are different. Those do not define a shape. There's a blue triangle and a blue hexagon, so the color is not defining that this is a triangle. The number of sides or the number of vertices is defining that this is a triangle. At this point, students, when we're distinguishing between the attributes, they can use formal and informal language, just like when they classify the shapes. So with three-dimensional shapes, they will also be distinguishing between attributes that define the shape, and that's going to have to do with the number of faces, the number of edges, the number of vertices, or the number of bases that they may have on a given three-dimensional shape. Even the fact to identify attributes that define a two-dimensional shape, these are flat, these are not flat. These are going to have dimension, they have height, something we can pick up and hold. So students will be distinguishing between those attributes with the two-dimensional and three-dimensional shapes. So another TEK that the students have is that they need to be able to identify two-dimensional shapes. So the two-dimensional shapes are circle, triangle, rectangle. They also need to know square, and especially they need to know that the square is a special type of rectangle. A square has four sides that are all the same. These shapes are also the same shapes that they learned in kindergarten. In first grade, we're adding the rhombus and we're adding a hexagon. So we do have some pattern blocks that the students could use to help with identifying those shapes. The rhombus, we need to know that the definition of a rhombus is that it has four sides, that all sides are congruent, all sides are the same. So a square could also be termed as a rhombus if we're looking at that. When we think about the triangles, we want to make sure that we're exposing the students to a variety of triangles, not just the equilateral triangle. We want to make sure that they see right triangles, obtuse triangles. They don't have to know those terms, they just need to know this is a triangle just as much as this is a triangle because it has three sides and three vertices. So that's just about them identifying. When they identify them and you ask them what shape is this and they say it's a square, they need to be able to tell you, I know it's a square because, and they need to use formal geometric language when they're describing them. So they should use terms like sides and vertices. We don't want them using terms like points when they're starting to use their formal geometric language. Okay? So from these two-dimensional shapes, another TEK that the students have with 2D shapes is that they get to create two-dimensional shapes in first grade. So with that, there are a lot of manipulatives that the students can use. You can use straws, you can use toothpicks, you could use wiki sticks, you can use anything. Students can also just draw them. You can use markers and paper pencil. They could go to the computer lab and create them. But as they're drawing them, we want them to be talking about how do they know that that's the shape, that they're using those attributes to help create those shapes. So with the toothpicks, the students can just use Play-Doh, clay. I've seen jelly beans be used with them. You can use marshmallows. It really just depends on where you are as a teacher and what you want the students to use. They all have their benefits and they all have their disadvantages. So students could create a shape based on a description that you give them or a term. What I like about the straws is that you're able to cut the straws in different sizes, and that way students can create those irregular shapes. So I can make a triangle by using different size shapes. You could make rectangles by having the different size sides created there, and not just creating those regular shapes. Students can also use the geoboards to help them create a shape. As a teacher, you could say make a triangle, and the students have the ability to create a variety of different shapes on their geoboard with the rubber band. Just really set the expectation for the students. They do a really good job with geoboards. You just have to set the expectation about how they're used, what we can do with the rubber band, and what we can't do with the rubber band. Okay? So from that, continuing on with two-dimensional shapes, students also have to be able to compose a two-dimensional shape by joining 2 to 3 or 4 figures to produce a target shape. So I might be able to do an activity that looks like this. I need to build a hexagon using a trapezoid, or using 3 triangles and a trapezoid, and I'm trying to make a 6-sided figure that looks like this. And so I can just give students task cards and they can create them. The pattern blocks are a great resource for these, and allows them to manipulate and practice and start over and practice and start over until they make the desired shape that was given. Okay, so that's the compose two-dimensional shapes by joining 2, 3, or 4 figures to make one in more than one way if possible. So moving on, we're going to go back and look at teaks that have to do with three-dimensional shapes. We already talked about the students need to be able to distinguish between attributes that define a three-dimensional shape and attributes that don't. The only other teak that involves students talking about three-dimensional shapes, they have to be able to identify three-dimensional solids using formal language. So they're going to have to be able to know face, edge, vertice or vertex, and they need to know base. So these are the shapes that the students need to know. Here's our sphere, our cylinder, cone, rectangular prism, cube, more rectangular prisms, and then a triangular prism. The only 2 that are new are the triangular prism and the rectangular prism for first grade. These shapes over here, the cone, the sphere, the cylinder, and the cube, those are all from kindergarten. They did have to be able to identify these. As we work with three-dimensional shapes and even two-dimensional shapes, be sure that you're using real objects as well. I need to be able to see these in the real world and know that the party hat is the cone. Know that a can also looks like a cylinder. That way they're not just being exposed to these wooden blocks or our plastic blocks that we have. When we talk about faces and bases with the students, we don't need to get too technical with them, other than we as teachers need to know that if it is a polygon, it can be a face. So this cylinder has 2 bases. It does not have any faces. There are bases and faces on this, but we just want the students to know that this is a face, this is a face, this is a face, to help them with that. So if you have any other questions on 2D or 3D geometry in first grade, let us know.